want to welcome and thank Dr. Daniel Hickey for giving the webinar on situated cognition and recognition of learning. And Dr. Hickey is a professor and program coordinator with the Learning Science program at Indiana University. He's also a research scientist with the IU Center for Research on Teaching and Learning. He completed his PhD in psychology at Vanderbilt University and was a postdoctoral fellow at the ETS Center for Performance Assessment. His research has been supported by a number of organizations, including MacArthur Foundation, the U.S. National Science Foundation, Google, the Department of Education in the United States, and Indiana University. So without much further ado, I hand this off to Dr. Hickey. It's all yours.
So hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm really thrilled to be here. It's an honor and a pleasure. As I said, I'm with the Learning Sciences program. I've been here since 2005 with my colleagues, and Cindy Mello Silver is the director of the Center for Research on Learning and Technology. So another big shout out that I want to emphasize here is to my doctoral advisors, Jim, Susan, and John at Vanderbilt. I just every day think of how blessed I was with the opportunities I was given and the mentorship from them. I also want to shout out to Paul Pintrich and Division 15, and particularly Ed Psychologist. Paul was the editor of Ed Psychologist, and it was his encouragement and patience in editing that was my first, for me, was a very important publication. And thanks to Clark and Catherine, the current editors. I think Ed Psychologist is just a fabulous journal, and Division 15 is just awesome. So it's really an honor to be invited to present. I also want to say thanks to Jim G. Jim was a very important mentor of mine at a very crucial point in my career about 10 years ago. Sort of expanded beyond the work I was doing with educational video games and provided a really cogent critique of my work that pointed me to the late Randy Engle's work, which, as I'll show you, has been extremely influential. So the title of my talk really is a homage/riff on this article, which was published in 1989, the year that I joined, that Jim and Susan and I left UC Santa Barbara after my first year with them, and joined John and others to form the Learning Technology Center at Vanderbilt. And I really spent the next 10 years really trying to make sense of this article and this class of perspectives that was introduced to the world in this article. And so definitely the title of my talk is a riff on it. This work came together about the same time that I got to Vanderbilt. The Institute for Research on Learning, these and other esteemed scholars began crafting what came to be known as situated cognition. This is a nice summary from Wikipedia. I've never found an actual reference for it, but it's probably the single best synthesis of the principles of learning to come out of the work that happened during that decade across the 90s. And this should be familiar, I think, with many of you who were in attendance. But what I'm going to do in my talk is show how I pushed really, really hard on these perspectives. And particularly the idea that not only is learning fundamental social, but the very nature of knowledge is social, and that learning is an act of membership, and that knowing really depends on engagement in practice. And I'll return to this point, but it's really important to distinguish between disciplinary knowledge, what experts know, independent of context, and disciplinary practices, what experts do in specific contexts of practice, which enable them to be recognized as experts. So I first was immersed in those perspectives in my major area paper, which was written in '93 but published in '97 under the encouragement and patience of Paul Pintrich. And in this article, I referred to it as socio-constructivist perspectives, and I really subsequently came to realize that I was kind of straddling a fence at the time that I didn't really recognize that I was sitting on. The Vanderbilt group, we did quite a bit of work. This anchored instruction and its relationship to situated cognition came out a year later. I was blessed with a bunch of just great opportunities, and one of them was to work with everybody on the Jasper project. This was a very groundbreaking model of pedagogy, of constructivist pedagogy, using interactive video discs I was blessed with a huge opportunity in my dissertation in that I was able to do a pretty comprehensive study of the consequences of Jasper and it was actually 4 schools of students and a really nice natural experiment. And while I was pleased with this study, it left me dissatisfied. What was nice about this study was that we were able to show that Jasper, when used by teachers whose orientation was consistent with socio-constructivist perspectives, specifically the NCTM standards, it had a remarkable impact on math problem-solving performance on the Iowa Test of Basic Skills. But when it was used by teachers whose orientation was relatively less consistent with those perspectives, it actually had a non-significant negative impact. And on one hand, that was a really important set of findings, but on the other hand, it left me dissatisfied, and especially the motivational results they were kind of useless. I didn't know what to do about it. And just as I was leaving Vanderbilt in '95 to head to educational testing service for to work at the Center for Performance Assessment, Joyce Moore, who was one of Jim Greeno's students, kind of pulled me aside and basically said, and I don't remember her exact words, but she basically said, you're not getting the full picture here. You're missing. There's more to this perspective than you're seeing. And in particular, she pointed me to this article, the Greeno, Smith, and Moore, where Jim Greeno introduced what came to be known as the situative synthesis that he described in much more detail in his 1998 APA presidential address. And what I came to realize over time was that there was this just huge tension that corresponded with every sort of new wave of educational technology. We saw it with the very beginning of computers. You had Plato, a mastery learning system, and then you had Logo, Pappard's famous sort of constructionist, discovery-oriented learning setting. When we got into the CD-ROM era in the 90s, the heyday of computer education, because people could make money off of it, teachers, with their purchase orders, could choose between Math Blaster or Logical Journey of the Zumbinis, 2 very, very different ways of thinking about using the computer. And these tensions have continued. We see them with the MOOCs, the constructivist MOOCs versus the ex-MOOCs. And I really came to realize that many tensions in education, in particular the debate over extrinsic incentives, which I've been very immersed in, but also tensions between formative and summative assessment, between different kinds of classroom discipline. Many of them can be traced to this tension between what I will characterize as associationist perspectives that are really based on this sort of assembly line metaphor. Right? Those of you who know your Volkswagens will recognize that split back window there on that assembly line as an early 50s, 52 in particular. And those models of learning really date back, to the 50s and before. Now, when the cognitive revolution happened in the late 70s, the whole associationist perspective did not go away. They more or less just replaced the sort of stimulus response associations of behaviorism with if-then cognitive associations. But out of the cognitive revolution, we got, constructivism, a very different and a very antithetical model of learning that really focuses on a higher order conceptual schema that the human mind is uniquely qualified or uniquely programmed to create in attempting to make sense of the world. The problem is that there's just this fundamental tension because of the antithetical relationship between these two. They're both focused on individual learners, but with 2 very, very different ways of thinking about how individuals learn. And so these perspectives don't get along. And I contend that many tensions in education, that I believe that educational psychology, especially the applied cognitive psychology version of educational psychology and a socio-constructivist practices, I just don't think we've made enough progress on. And about the time during my postdoctoral years at ETS, struggling through some complicated issues of formative assessment, I really became convinced that particularly with networked learning, as we moved into the Web 2.0, that the so-called situative perspectives, like John Seely Brown wrote about in this 2008 EDUCAUSE article, that Greeno was really onto something when he talked about the situative synthesis, because it allowed you to incorporate both of these prior perspectives. And I won't get into it too far, but the fundamental argument is that if you treat learning as primarily social and secondarily individual, it offers new solutions to the kinds of problems that have bedeviled educational psychology. Now, I'm a learning scientist. I am a psychologist, but I take a learning sciences approach to this in that I'm saying, what I'm arguing is, I don't want to debate the fundamental nature of cognition in a cognitive psychology sense. What I want to argue is that if we pretend or assume, frankly, that learning is primarily social and that the way that humans behave, the way that organisms, including humans, behave in response to contingencies in the environment, and the way that the human mind appears to process information, if we treat both of those as special cases of situated cognition, in other words, cognition that is fundamentally situated in the social and material and technological context where that knowledge is used and learned, it reveals new solutions to enduring problems in education. That's sort of my fundamental argument. I've built that argument over my career, I guess, starting with the GenScope. This is what I did at ETS with Paul Horowitz and Ann Keinfield. I spent 10 wonderful years working with one of the very, very best pieces of educational technology to come out of the early the Apple II era. Was funded from NASA Classroom of the Future to apply the early version of the framework that I'll talk about here. This sort of multi-level assessment. I tried to apply that framework to mathematics with a good grant from the NSF and failed miserably. That's the project that I was referring to Jim G earlier. The current version of the framework I'm going to show you today really took shape in my collaboration with Sasha Barov on Quest Atlantis here at IU. Further took shape in collaboration with Henry Jenkins and his colleagues in Project New Media Learning. And so these are the specific articles where I've explored this basic idea in terms of motivation, in terms of program evaluation, in the context of assessment, and most recently in the context of networked online learning and digital badges and e-credentials. So I'm going to focus on those last two settings in the talk I'm giving today. Around 2008, I really moved pretty hard into online learning. I began teaching my own courses online. In 2012, what I'll focus on today was I received a grant from Google to take my existing course on educational assessment and blow it up into what I called a BOOC, a big open online course. Not a MOOC, not massive, but big. I wanted to take the sort of the principles that I'll show you today that I had been refining really for about 5 years in my online courses and try to scale them up so that hundreds of people could engage in this sort of participatory online courses. This framework is currently being used by 3 teachers that I'm collaborating closely with at Indiana University, one of the largest online high schools in the country. And I'm also using it in my own courses currently, Learning and Cognition, being taught by 2 adjuncts here at IU. So this is what I call participatory learning and assessment. These are 5 design principles that have emerged over really about 15 years of work. And I'm going to go back through all of these, but a couple of points I want to make here about them is you notice the distinction between public, local, and private, drawing from Rogers Hall's work, that label. I've added to that the notion of discrete. The argument that I'm going to make here is that these different contexts afford different forms of engagement that afford different kinds of learning and evidence. So for example, as I'll explain, if you take a situative lens and apply it to classroom assessment and high-stakes testing, you're basically just treating them as peculiar forms of discourse. And this is what I mean by the advantage of the situative synthesis. So let me just go ahead and dive right in. So this is my educational assessment BOOC. This is a course I've been teaching for, oh God, my entire career. I got a grant from Google in 2013 to use Google Course Builder to offer this as an open course. And I still would have students enroll in it for credit, but I would accept it in 2013 up to 600 enrollees who could take the course and get a digital badge showing their competency appropriate to a graduate level course, a rigorous graduate level course in educational assessment. There you can see that the course consisted of 3 modules, or 3 parts, and each of those consisted of 4 or 5 units and concluded with an exam. Awesome team. I just can't say enough about the wonderful people, the students and staffers who have helped me with this project. Thomas Smith in particular is an extraordinary programmer. So first principle is use public context to give meaning to knowledge tools. So Rogers Hall was the one who's one of Jim Greeno's students, who helped me appreciate what it means to have people interacting in public. Um, think back to the last webinar, Eric talked about cheating. Well, what I'm trying to do is make all learners' engagement, well, almost every bit of engagement is primarily public. So it's not possible to copy people's work because of the way we're problematizing engagement. So the point is that you resolutely have each student provide a context, and then you use that context for their engagement. It should be a disciplinary problem, and it should embody their experience, their interest, and their aspirations. So this is the registration page for my book. You can't register for my course without defining a curricular aim that embodies your particular educational practice, or an actual or imagined practice. And when you then enter the course, your very first assignment takes whatever you gave and has you restate it, and has you actually read a chapter. We use Jim Popham's excellent textbook. You read a chapter on defining curricular aims, and very quickly people realize that actually we're talking about a curricular aim. They're actually talking about a teaching practice, and it's a bit of work to transform that aim into or that practice into an aim that lends itself well to multiple kinds of assessment. And that's a good example of the kind of activity that you want someone to look at what other students do, and most importantly, look at the feedback that I provide them on their document. In this case, I call these things wikifolios. So that way I can go in and just give a little bit of feedback to the early posters and not have to give that feedback over and over again. So that's what we mean by public engagement. We then have students define their role in education. It's really important, right? That assessment means something very different to an administrator than to a classroom teacher, than to a researcher, and we use those differences to help engage learners. This is a Wikifolio. The little gray things open and close to give the instructions, and then when you click the edit box on the upper right, you get a standard WYSIWYG editor in which you can do your work. So for example, this is a good example of what I'm talking about. So this, in chapter 2, they have to struggle through a fairly difficult part of a chapter, which is deciding what to assess. That's a really abstract notion. It's not as abstract as validity, but it really doesn't make sense until students actually think about it in their own learning context. We have a bunch of optional elements for the non-credit students. If they want to do them, they can, but they're required for the for-credit students. So I added some new features to this in 2015. I did add videos, but I want to make a really important point here about online courses and videos. My videos are optional, and what I do in those videos is I model the kind of engagement. So I explain, how I do assessment in my own classes, and I explain why in my doctoral seminars I don't use multiple choice tests, but in the class you're taking right now I do, and here's why. And here's how I evaluated those items in my setting. So, and I had another really cool feature, right? So in the validity chapter, when students are learning about content criterion and construct-related validity, when they go into the edit mode, they literally just drag those boxes in order of the most relevant to them for their context. And so, the graduate student, well, they would probably put construct-related validity first, and then the administrators and teachers who respectively probably chose criterion validity and content validity, all of a sudden can look at what the graduate student did, the handful of students out of the 100 or so who chose construct validity, and realize, oh, they're studying self-efficacy, and self-efficacy is a construct. Oh, they made up, the psychologist constructed that. Oh, so that kind of back and forth and discussion is really helpful for making sense of complex topics such as the different forms of validity evidence. I added some other cool features there on the bottom. You can see I'm able to feed this information back in sophisticated graphs, and so they can see that 45 of the 50 administrators chose criterion validity as most relevant. So one thing this does is generate a lot of engagement. I'm really proud of the fact that, here you see in blue, those are the students for credit, but what you see over there in the other lines, those are students who are enrolled. They're not taking it for credit. And even the students in green who eventually dropped the class in that they didn't complete all 12 assignments and earn the final digital badge for assessment expertise, we're still writing an average of 1,000 words a week. And these are deeply contextualized, personalized. These are not just ramblings. This is really fairly serious writing. What do we do with all that writing? Who grades it? Well, nobody grades it. In none of my courses do I grade any of the content. I'll show you later though. Instead, what we do is we discuss it. And so this is where Randy Engle's work became very important for me. Randy taught me that disciplinary engagement involves both the declarative knowledge, again, what experts know independent of context, and disciplinary practices, the more cultural, the more contextual practices that experts do in contexts that afford them acting like experts. And the things that really, if you think about it, when people are labeled experts, it's because they know how to use their disciplinary knowledge in these very nimble, contextualized ways to solve problems that only experts are able to solve. Now, productive disciplinary engagement, which Randy introduced in 2002, is the kind of engagement that makes a lot of connections between the disciplinary knowledge of the course and each learner's own nascent disciplinary practices. And this is why it's so important to problematize content from the perspectives of the learner. Now, we're not talking about problem-based learning where you offer a suite of problems that experts have identified that are ideal for learning. That's problematizing from the expert's perspective. We're talking about problematizing from the student's perspective by opening up problems that experts may well see as solved. And it's best to do this publicly, as I said, and don't grade it in any way. Don't even require it. What you want to do is find other ways to motivate that engagement so that you don't get these bland, boring discussion posts that are so often found in online courses. So the framework that I have here really represents my embedding of Randy's 4 design principles for productive disciplinary engagement into the 3 levels that I had previously defined in what I called my multi-level assessment model coming out of the GenScope work. So the first 2 design principles in what I'm calling PLA, participatory learning and assessment, really are a collapsing of 4 of Randy's principle here. And this first one is problematizing content, again, from the learner's perspective. Then you give students authority. So there are no known answer questions anywhere in my course except for in the private assessments. And this allows me to position the students as stakeholders. They are the experts. They know more about the relevance of the course content to their personal context than anyone else on the planet. And you want to let them be that expert. You want, though, to establish disciplinary accountability. You want to teach them how to defend their positions. But most importantly, you have to provide relevant resources to do this. So at the end of each weekly assignment, these are self-paced against a weekly deadline, students are instructed, but not actually required. We go back and forth with this a little bit. We tell them to, but there's no penalty if they don't. They're instructed to post questions and discuss. And this is what this looks like. This is a very good example of the kind of threaded comments that are occurring directly on completed student work. Right, so they're not going off to a discussion forum. There's a discussion forum, but that's only for housekeeping. All of the discussions happen directly on the student work, and it really fosters remarkable levels of remarkably productive forms of disciplinary engagement. We added a really cool new feature. Again, Thomas Grenfell Smith, just a programmer extraordinaire, added this feature called endorsement and promotion. So there you can see on the left that students are invited, but again, not required, to endorse as many of their peers directly on their Wikifolio for being complete. And then they are allowed to promote one and only one of their peers' work each week as being exemplary. But they're not allowed to promote it without explaining why. So here you can see an example of what that looks like directly on the student work. You can see that the promotions themselves also are a form of productive disciplinary engagement. And if we have time, I hope we can talk about this. I'm working on a chapter about precisely this point, that people criticize these kinds of things as being extrinsic incentives, and I say absolutely not. That if the incentives and the competitions themselves generate productive forms of disciplinary engagement and are based on disciplinary engagement, it is a mistake to dismiss that as being an extrinsic incentive and to assume that that will undermine intrinsically motivated engagement. I say completely to the opposite, and I will go to my grave saying that. I'll talk about badges later more, but this is the credential you earn, and if you get more of those promotions than anyone else in your particular networking group, right? So when you sign up for the course, if you're an administrator in a university setting, you get put into that networking group. And if you happen to get more endorsements than anyone else in that group in a module, when you get the module badge, it actually has that leader heading across the top. And when you, right, so I'll take a bit of a diversion here to digital badges. These are web-enabled micro-credentials, and this is what is inside of the badge. When you earn the assessment expertise badge, and you post the URL for that badge on Facebook, this is an actual thing. It will come, this is what you will see in Facebook, and if you click on it, it will take you to the evidence page, and here you can see, there you see on the left, you can see the number of comments and endorsements and the number of exemplary stamps that a person got. And if you click on the hot links for the work is contained in the badge. This is what I mean by situated cognition and recognition of learning. We're actually able to put the completed student work, all of the discussion of that work, and the promotion of that work is in the credential itself. This is why we're so excited about digital badges. This is also why we're able to have these competencies that are very different than what you see in conventional competency-based education. I'm involved in this movement. I think those of you out there who are not, you better be, because it's just here to stay, especially under the new administration. They're just going to promote it, and I really think it's really important that we make sure that it not turn into this very impoverished version of mechanistic gamification of mastery of specific associations. Rather, I would say, let's have competencies like you're able to productively discuss classroom assessment principles with professional peers, as evidenced by the number and nature of comments on the individual Wikifolios. And you notice that I start with these participatory competencies, and I finish with very conventional measured competencies: recognize biased assessment items, reliability factors, and valid uses of evidence, as evidenced by the exam score. And you see here. So I want you to just take a second and think about what this means, what this digital credential that someone can display on their Facebook page, they can send to their supervisor for professional growth points, they can bring, as many students did, to their faculty at their own university because they don't offer a course on classroom assessment, and do it as a directed study. They can just email this, and you can dig as deep as you want. This is what we mean by recognition of learning. Here you can see that in the case that the promotion of the exemplary work was actually included directly in the badge, and you can see a summary of the endorsements and the participants, but you can see all the work that this student did. Now, this was a 4-credit student, but this is a pretty compelling piece of work. I think that this student, anybody who looks at this, who understands validity, can say, yes, that individual not only learned about the disciplinary concepts of validity and the difference between criterion construct and content validity, they're able to discuss it with diverse professional peers. So notice here that these students have extended their username to further project their identities as professionals. And here you can see the earner of the badge in the bottom there. He is a 4-credit student. He's in adult ed. The person above who asked him a question about it, who liked his work and who liked the course, right? So there's 6 comments here. Here you can see talking with my awesome teaching assistant, Suraj. And here you can see, for instance, other comments from other classmates who are not enrolled in the 4-credit class, a librarian in medical education. So again, that's productive disciplinary engagement. That is the holy grail in my course. And what I've been doing throughout my career is in these various settings using design-based research. This is the iterative refinement of the features in the course to get the most productive, the most interaction that's as productive as possible. And then looking to see what is the consequence of those changes, of those interactions between individuals, resources, and peers. What are the consequences of those interactions on individual knowledge. That's what I mean by the situative synthesis. I don't start with the individual, I start with the social. Right? Look at the number of comments. The comments average about 100 words per comment. And you can see that we're averaging around 5 comments a week. That's a lot of work for busy professionals, many of whom are taking a free course. What I'm really excited about is when we coded those comments, a representative sample, right? So if we gave a comment a 3 if it was about the topic of the chapter, a 2 if it was about assessment, and a 1 if it was about education. And you can see for all of these 3 groups, almost all of their comments are about the topic of the chapter. So we've solved a really big problem in online learning, and that is it goes off into a million different directions. We're staying very focused. Then we also coded comments to see if they were referencing contexts of use. In other words, did a nascent disciplinary practice, right? Did someone talk about assessment in their own professional context? So to what extent were people connecting the disciplinary knowledge of the textbook and the assignments to their nascent disciplinary practices as relatively expert assessors in their professional context? We found that over half of the comments in 2013 referenced the chapter. The kind of thing that we've been discovering, though, for instance, in 2014, we elected to require students to post a question to their peers, and it cut the contextualization in half. Literally, it went from 0.5 to 0.25, which was not a good thing because we didn't want that. So I can talk about why I think that was if we have time, but that's what I mean by design-based iterative refinements that are focusing primarily on productive disciplinary engagement and only secondarily on what I assume is happening in the minds of the learners. So again, what do we do with all this content? We don't grade it, for starters. There's just too much. And more importantly, if you do grade it, then you get this game going on of people saying, did I write enough? Did I do what I needed to do to get the points? No, don't do that. Instead, what I do, and this is Melissa Grisolfi's ideas and inspired a lot of this notion of consequential engagement. So, and I use this in all of my classes. Students post a brief reflection on their engagement. This is not a reflection on their knowledge, rather a reflection on their prior engagement with the material and their peers. If that reflection is coherent and complete and they posted the assignment on time, they get all their points. So I spend minutes grading in my classes. I spend very little time. All of my interaction, most of my interaction is public, and there's almost no private interaction between me and a student because that's kind of a waste of time. Instead, they're instructed to post this reflection at the bottom of their Wikifolio. And this first one is contextual engagement. So if you'll see, they're focused on the intersection of the general ideas with your specific context. A student who can explain how their own context helped them or didn't understand the content, well, they've engaged. It's almost impossible to write this, but more importantly, there's an anthropological notion of prolepsis, and that is how the future shapes the present. Because the students know that they're going to have to write this reflection, it shapes their engagement as they go. And this is the kind of thing you see. I don't have time to get into it other than to say that I'm able to just look at this, and it's almost impossible to write this if you haven't engaged. If it's there, they get their points. We also have a collaborative engagement, and this serves an important motivational function. People like to see their name in other people's reflections. They like to see, they really work at it. You can see it happening. People really push on people's ideas and challenge them, and then the person thanks them in their collaborative engagement in public. And that's a really motivational thing. And then consequential engagement, what are you going to do differently? What are the more general consequences? So these reflections are very, again, these are also disciplinary and productive, and they're quite lengthy. There you can see that they're averaging about 300 words per reflection in the 2015 analysis. So now we get into assessment. So Pamela Moss has been a very important influence of mine. I really think a lot about classroom assessment, especially very early in my career. I found Pam's writing incredibly influential. So what I do is at the end of each assignment, I offer an ungraded, open-ended performance task that cover the big ideas in the assignment. But this is where I diverge from a lot of my colleagues in formative assessment. There's an article in the journal Educational Assessment and Education, the British journal, on what I call the conundrum of formative assessment that just came out last year. So rather than students going back and learning the answer to the item they got wrong, which is what happens in a lot of formative assessment, they're instructed to, I tell them explicitly, that item will not be on the final exam. You are not prepared for the final exam. You need to go back, re-engage with the materials, re-engage with your peers before you move on. And that's what this looks like. Notice that's my wording up there. If you did poorly, you should go back and re-engage with your classmate. And this is simple. That's a fairly challenging open-ended question. They have to put something before they can see the answer. There's no accountability whatsoever. I can analyze this information, but this all happens in private. This is what I mean by private engagement. Finally, I put myself here because I'm very much out on a limb here. I get in a lot of arguments about this. I think there's a time and a place for a well-constructed multiple choice test. And this is what I mean by discrete measurement, right? So if you want to measure gains, you want to compare instruction, really the only way to do it is with a well-designed multiple choice test for reasons that I've articulated in my writing. You want to refine the tests but never teach to them. I never know what's on my tests. I usually use items from item banks. I try to get items that have a test that are about 85% correct, that are normally distributed, and a handful of students get a perfect score. But I never show them the item level feedback, and it's a timed test, right? So I give about a minute, maybe 2 minutes per item. But I use a lot of the so-called best answer items, where it really is impossible to look up the answer. And then the rest of the items have you would have to search for all 5 of the responses in the item to figure out what the correct answer is. And if students don't know it, they're not going to pass the test. And here you can see, again, I'm aiming for about 85% correct. And so these are fairly comprehensive exams. And I'm pretty confident that, people know stuff when they get those exams. So that's my big open online course. I'm not sure what I'm going to do with it. I am currently actually, for the first time in a long time, without a grant. I have a couple of proposals pending. If anybody is interested in collaborating, my dance card is open for the first time in some time for new proposals. And one of the things I'm really excited about and looking to resubmit to the NSF, we'll see if I tried once, is to blow up what I call the assessment network, which is, it's a self-paced. People can come in at any time they want and complete the assignments anytime they want. And by this archiving feature, they can identify current or prior students who have indicated that they will interact with them. And if someone puts a comment or a question on another student's work, it generates an email to that person with a hot link back to the work. So I have succeeded now in having not a huge number of students, but dozens of students going through and completing this entirely on their own. But I've kind of broken the code, and I don't have a programmer anymore, so that's kind of on pause for now. Some of you may be familiar with the Badges for Lifelong Learning initiative that came out of the MacArthur Foundation. And as I said, I've been supported by MacArthur. I've really had the blessing and the support of Connie Owell. I was fortunate enough to be funded from really for 6 years on the Digital Media and Learning Initiative, and opportunity to work, for instance, with Mimi Ito, who helped shape the study I'm going to talk about today. But a very important thing happened early in my career, and that is that I was struggling with my 2003 paper in elementary school journal, what I call my motivation manifesto. It's sort of my most strident, it's literally a stridently situative approach to achievement motivation. And I had learned by then that if you're going to publish in a smaller journal, you should make sure that you cite anybody else who's published in that journal who's talked about it. And I ran across this article by this Constance Yowell, who I'd never heard of, and it turned out to be a brilliant takedown of DARE, drug awareness, resistance, education, from an explicitly situative perspective. And it really opened my eyes, and I really dug into it, and through that I got to know Connie Owell's work, and that certainly helped, didn't hurt my chances of getting brought in by Jim G into the MacArthur world later on. And I think this is a really great article. And that perspective, and Mimi Ito, who studied at San Diego with Michael Cole's group, anthropologists. The two of them really have shaped my thinking immensely, but they also gave a lot of shape to this initiative on digital badges, which I'm going to talk about now. So digital badges, unlike conventional credentials, contain information. They can, as I showed you, they can contain specific claims, specific evidence, and links to more of both. And this is different because that information can circulate in networks. It can be crowdsourced. It can gain additional meaning. It amplifies the claims. And it makes it possible, for instance, for third parties to endorse credentials in a way that we've simply never seen before. So the DML competition got 600 proposals to develop these open badge systems. They funded 29 of them. And the DPD project, my awesome colleagues here, Katerina Schenke, by the way, who won the Paul Pintrich Award that came out of Division 15, and I'm currently working on a chapter with, has just been immensely helpful. We took these 29 projects, and we watched what happened. We were not allowed actually to help them. There was another team led by Cheryl Grant, whose job it was to support these projects. Our job was to simply look and see what happened, what led to successful projects, and specifically, what were the more easier to implement practices for using badges. So you can see here, these were very diverse projects covering quite a bit of different content. One of the things we did was we tried to categorize these projects. This was a challenge, but I'm pretty confident in these categorizations. The first 7 of them were explicitly competency-based education. 3 of them were funded by the Gates Project Mastery, and they were self-paced, individualized learning. And the recognition was for individual mastery of very specific competencies. So that's what they were trying to put in badges, was extensive evidence of mastery of specific competencies. On the other hand, 12 of them were clearly much more consistent with modern constructivist and socio-constructivist perspectives. These included both cohorted and self-paced projects. Most of them were either problem-based or inquiry-based. Importantly, most of them used performance and portfolio assessment, primarily though to recognize learning by individuals. So that's the kind of evidence that they were trying to get into digital badges to motivate and recognize learning. 5 of these projects were really consistent with situative perspectives. Generally speaking, these were cohorts of learners learning together in networked learning settings. Much of the recognition, consistent, I think, with the original vision of badges coming out of Mozilla and peer-to-peer university, was that badges were being awarded sometimes from groups to groups, and often those badges were awarded not for competency, but for participation. Right? So I want to make a real important point here that, well, I'll return to this point. These were not attendance badges. These were participation badges. And then 5 of these projects were really hybrid. You could find elements of all 3 types of practices in there. They didn't really fit in any one category. What we were tasked to do was capture the practical wisdom, Aristotle's phronesis, or what I really like is Rich Halverson's notion of artifact-based phonetic narrative. So if you think about badges as an innovative artifact, what's the practical knowledge that can surround those artifacts? And we looked in terms of 4 categories of badge functions. Badges obviously are used to recognize learning, and if you're going to recognize learning, you need some sort of an assessment. And if you're recognizing and assessing learning, whether you're acknowledging it or not, you're motivating students. And then finally, since badges contain evidence, they're a really good source of information for studying learning. We looked at the initial design principles in the projects, in the proposals. That led to a more general set of design principles, and then we bookmarked that with research. Now, I don't really have time. I'm actually still finishing a report of the detailed principles, but what we did was we looked at what happened in these projects, right? So in 2014, when the funding was over and the projects submitted their final report, was there a badge system in place? Was there no system? Was it different than the one they proposed? Or was it the intended one? And more importantly, was there a broader educational ecosystem around those badges? And was it similar or different to the one that was proposed? Then finally, we followed up in 2015, a year later, to say what had become of those ecosystems. Were they still existing? Was it there, but not really, or was it thriving? Were there people, new earners, earning badges and getting internships and using them in their admissions and stuff? So So the first finding from the DPD project is that badges appear to work better in some places than others. There you can see that only 16 of those 29 projects actually implemented their intended badge system. 5 of them never even implemented any badges to any earners. And then only 11 really ended up with the ecosystem sort of envisioned in the original proposal. When we followed up, though, there were only 6 of the 29 projects that could be categorized as thriving. 13 sort of were existing, and 10 of them had pretty just gone by the wayside. So the obvious question is how'd that go? How different kinds of projects. You can see on the left the sort of so-called situative or sociocultural projects. 4 of the 5 were still thriving. That's in remarkable contrast to the more associationist projects, the 6 explicitly competency-based education and 1 game-based education. Only 1 of them was thriving. And then we found more mixed results from the constructivist and hybrid practices. So these 7 competency-based projects, they were rejecting the seat time and very explicitly, mostly for formal course credit, mostly with summative assessment of very, very, very well-specified competencies, and a lot of extrinsic motivators for specific points. And so these were competency badges. These were measured and measurable competencies, as we see in competency-based education. And literally just 1 of those projects, and most of them never got off the ground, in part because it was so much work to set these things up. Now, all 3 of the Gates Project Mastery awardees, 2 of them were suspended after a brief pilot. 1 of them never implemented. So only BuzzMath, which essentially used non-open badges in a gamified math practice site. It's the only one that succeeded in building a thriving badge system with an educational ecosystem around it. Now, if you want to know more and if you want some cautionary tales about competency-based education, I encourage you to look at the very rigorous study that RAND did of the 3 Gates Project Mastery projects, which amplified and confirmed our findings and then added a bunch more. Well, where learning was again more participatory, more consistent with a situative perspective envisioned by badges originally, we found that 4 of them were still thriving over a year after the funding ran out. These were all of these projects, and I'm looking at time here. I'm running pretty close to the end. So all of these projects really involve network learning. Many of them involve media production. The S2R network supported reporters in the UK for youth journalism and the PBS Student Reporting Lab. Both were enormously successful and are still thriving, as is Mouse. So in the interest of time, I'll just say that the very different and mixed results for the constructivist projects. 4 of them were still thriving a year later. These were really completion badges. These were badges that recognized the completion of projects and problem-based activities. Assessment was a huge challenge. The only projects that really thrived are those that either made very modest expectations for assessments or scaled back their original assessments dramatically. The real problem was that it was so much work to earn and then assess these badges that the badges just weren't valuable enough in many cases, is what we discovered. And we found similar results for the hybrid projects. We see that the 2 that were thriving, especially the computer science support network at Carnegie Mellon, they automated many of the assessment practices. So probably one of the big findings there. I've got a lot more findings if anybody's interested. So let me wrap up here by giving a heads up. This is a chapter that I'm working on right now with Kat Schenke, Ann Renninger, and Susan Hickey, who I'm sure many of you know, are working on the Cambridge Handbook of Motivation and Learning. And these are the 6 arguments that we make in this chapter. This is a question that comes up all the time around badges. People say badges are extrinsic incentives. I've heard it over and over again. Well, our argument is that the information in badges is inherently meaningful. And if you're giving someone a badge that unlocks opportunities, like an internship in the case of the most successful projects, it's a little hard to imagine that disempowers them, as Alfie Kohn continues to insist. And we argue that open information is even more meaningful. Many of us met in Bologna in October for the Bologna Open Recognition Declaration, the board. There's a lot to be learned here about open recognition. I'll have an article coming out in EduCause Review in 2 weeks that articulates some of these things. But we're really arguing in the chapters that open credentials are particularly disruptive and transformative. We believe that open credentials really have much more potential to foster positive kinds of disruption and to transform networked learning into truly powerful learning environments. Along the way, we think that the intrinsic and extrinsic dichotomy is itself overstated, and that the negative consequences of extrinsic rewards are also overstated. Finally, I believe, and I hope that I've convinced at least some of you, that situative models of engagement are really ideal for motivating learning in digital networks, and that self-determination theory, I'm the go-to reviewer for almost every badge article, it seems, and many of them are using self-determination theory, and I just don't think that that's the right match for thinking about these models of motivation that underlie networked learning. If you're interested, my blog is called Remediating Assessment. I've got a series there now called Competencies in Context. You can see that from their LRN. So many of us are really excited about this notion of learning recognition networks. This article is the one that's being, the EduCause Review asked me to publish, and that'll be coming out in a couple of weeks. I'll be doing an article in the editorial in the Chronicle of Higher Ed, basically making the argument that if you're in the business of issuing e-credentials and you're dismissing the internet, or if you're in the business of credentialing learning right now in 2017, and you're dismissing digital credentials such as badges as a fad, you're going to look an awful lot like publishers and retailers in 1997 who similarly dismissed e-commerce as a fad. This is what is really happening, is this integration of e-portfolios and digital badges. This is going to take the world by storm, I predict. In another 2 years, I think we'll see this explosion. But Portfolio and Chalk and Wire in particular with their new MyMantle platform have a remarkable integration that I'm really excited about and happy to be helping along and promoting, and also trying to get some serious funding behind for doing research. So again, if anybody's out there with any foundations who think this is interesting, I'm very aggressively pursuing continued funding. We had 2 years of funding from 2014 to 2016 to support the open badges ecosystem in higher ed from MacArthur, and that was very helpful. So I'd love to continue that work. So I'll leave with that slide, and I'll come back to the camera. And I'll leave those references up. There's plenty more where it came from. My email address is dthickey@indiana.edu. My Twitter handle is dthickey, and I'm pretty available for questions and stuff. But let me take a breath, and Aman, see what we've got for questions.
Okay, all right. So I think you ended with the need for funding to do some of this work, as you discussed. One of the questions we have is, can you imagine some low-tech ways to do the things you talked about, especially with badges, to engage
Great
students?
question. Yes, I don't have to imagine it. I can show it. The other talk that I do for this shows how we implement this in Canvas. And my good friend and colleague Nate Otto is building a brilliant tool called Badger, which is an external app which you can plug into Canvas, BADGR. Right now, my primary focus, I have some consulting work that's going to Nate to do some refinement and build that into Canvas. And I can show you, we will actually have, Nate and I have a couple of little projects going showing how vanilla off-the-shelf instantiation Canvas, we can implement this model. But I do have, there's an article in EduCause Review that talks about my P540 course, my Learning and Cognition course, which shows how this model is implemented without any additional tools in Canvas.
So it looks like some of the learning management systems are starting to go that way, having built-in badging systems to engage students. Another question we have is, like, one of the challenges of having teaching online is creating especially discussion posts. So how do you manage to avoid getting into the trap of grading students' discussion posts. There's a lot of rich data as you shared, but sometimes that's a challenge that instructors face. So that's one of the questions: how can we avoid that pitfall of constantly grading discussion posts?
Just don't grade them. There's no penalty if students don't post. What I do in my classes, though, is when it's clear that a student engagement is weak, so when their reflection, I know, like I see, I track it. I see who's doing what, and I warn them, well, you're going to bomb the exam. You're not engaging with your peers. You don't want to force students to go in and do sort of obligatory posting because you get these just ridiculous, terrible discussions. So you're trying to find other ways to motivate them, but you have to set it up right. The reason that many students don't engage in discussion forums in online classes is because they're stupid. People just go in and say the same thing over and over and over again. They post known answer questions and students give a response, or they try to say, just, talk about this, just discuss this. And this is my point about why you need a situative lens to think about this, because the lens of productive disciplinary engagement says, you literally in my online courses with graduate education students, they give each other what we call PDE stamps. It's literally a comment that starts with 3 ampersands for good examples of productive disciplinary engagement. So you really want to motivate that kind of engagement, and if you require it, I've tried it, it just ruins it. You start to see these, oh, that's nice. Just don't require it, and whatever you do, don't grade it. It's a complete waste of time.
Okay. Well, we have a minute left, so I want to take this opportunity to thank all the attendees for a very engaging webinar, and Dr. Dan Hickey for taking the time to come and talk to us. So thank you, Dan. Appreciate the time,
Awesome.
And I know all the effort that goes into planning giving a webinar, so appreciate your time.
Okay. Well, thank you, Aman, as well. I appreciate it, and thank you all for attending. I'm glad to see that. I'm hoping to see hoping some friends are out there. And again, my email address is ethickey@indiana.edu. I'm happy to field questions if you have requests for articles. So most of my stuff's available publicly, but if you can't find it, don't hesitate to write. Thanks a lot, Aman, and thanks everybody, and to Division 15 for inviting me. It's an honor, and I really appreciate it.